Okay, so you sent over a whole bunch of articles about this daylight saving time stuff.
Yeah,
It seems like you're really trying to figure this whole time change thing out.
a lot of people are.
Yeah, for sure. And we're here to help you sort through all of it.
Absolutely.
Is it really messing with our health?
Right.
Should we just get rid of the time change and stick with standard time? We're going to unpack all the research that you sent over so you can come to your own conclusions.
Sounds good.
Perfect. Now, you included some research from experts right here in BC
Uh-huh.
at UBC and SFU,
Okay.
and they're making a pretty compelling case against daylight saving time.
Yeah, they're suggesting that standard time is the healthier option
Hmm.
and that all this back and forth switching is doing more harm than good.
Right. And they're saying it's not just a matter of feeling a little groggy for a few days.
No,
They're highlighting some serious potential health risks.
exactly. There's growing evidence linking DST to increased risks of things like heart disease, diabetes,
Oh, wow.
and even mental health issues.
Re-
It's fascinating and a little bit alarming when you think about it.
Yeah, it is. So are they basically saying we should just rip off the Band-Aid and go with standard time year-round?
That's what they're recommending.
Okay.
They argue that the potential long-term health benefits outweigh any short-term inconvenience.
Interesting.
And it makes you think,
Yeah.
what if sticking with standard time is actually a form of preventative health care? That's a pretty compelling argument.
It is. Now, speaking of BC,
Yeah,
didn't they try to do something about the time change a few years back?
it did.
Yeah.
Back in 2019, the BC government actually passed legislation to get rid of the time change.
Okay.
They were all set to make DST permanent.
So why are we still switching our clocks twice a year?
What?
What happened?
Well, there's a catch. They decided to make DST permanent,
Mm-hmm.
but only if the U.S. West Coast follows suit.
Oh, so we're waiting for our neighbors to the south.
Exactly.
Okay.
But here's what's interesting. The survey the BC government used to gauge public opinion back then was a bit limited.
Limited how so?
It basically gave people two options: keep switching or make DST permanent. Permanent standard time wasn't even on the table.
So it wasn't really an accurate reflection of what people might actually want.
Exactly.
Hmm.
It highlights how complex this issue is
Yeah.
and how public opinion isn't always straightforward. You can't just present people with a binary choice and expect to capture all the nuances of their views.
Totally. So let's talk about the science behind all of this. Those experts from UBC and SFU keep mentioning how standard time is more in sync with our natural rhythms.
Right. It all comes down to our internal clocks, or what scientists call our circadian rhythms.
Okay.
It's basically our body's natural sleep-wake cycle, and it governs everything from our hormone production to our body temperature.
Okay, that makes sense.
And these internal clocks are heavily influenced by the sun. When the sun rises, it signals to our body to wake up.
Yeah.
And when it sets, it tells us it's time to wind down.
Pretty amazing, right?
Yeah, it is. So how does daylight saving time throw a wrench into all of this? Well, standard time aligns more closely with this natural solar time.
Okay.
When we're on standard time, our body clocks are more in sync with the rising and setting of the sun.
Hmm.
But DST shifts our clock time away from that natural rhythm,
Right.
which means we're essentially fighting against our own biology.
And that's why we feel so out of whack when we change the clocks.
Exactly. It's like experiencing a mini jet lag twice a year.
Oh.
And it's not just about feeling tired.
Right.
This disruption to our circadian rhythms has been linked to all sorts of health problems,
Mm-hmm.
from mood disorders to cardiovascular disease.
Wow. So
Yeah.
it's really not as simple as just gaining or losing an hour.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's about how that shift affects our body's internal clock
Yeah.
and how that in turn affects our overall health.
I'm starting to see why those experts are so concerned. Now, you mentioned teenagers being particularly affected by DST. Why is that?
Teenagers' internal clocks are naturally set later than those of adults.
Okay.
They naturally fall asleep and wake up later.
Oh, right. I remember how impossible it was to get out of bed for high school.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And DST just amplifies this natural delay, making it even tougher for teenagers to get enough sleep. It's like they're living in a perpetual state of jet lag,
Oh, wow.
which can impact their mood, their academic performance,
Yeah.
and their overall well-being.
Makes you wonder if adjusting school start times to better align with teenagers' natural sleep patterns could help.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's a growing movement to do just that.
Interesting.
It's all about recognizing the importance of sleep for adolescent development and adjusting our schedules accordingly.
Yeah.
It really ties into this whole conversation about aligning our lives with our natural rhythms.
It's fascinating how interconnected it all is. And speaking of connections, you mentioned something about where you live in a time zone making a difference, too.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. Think about it. On the western edge of a time zone, the sun rises and sets later than on the eastern edge, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Well, research has shown that people who live on the western edge of a time zone, where they're constantly battling those later sunsets,
Right.
they tend to get less sleep overall and have higher rates of those health problems we were talking about earlier.
Interesting.
It's like they're fighting a losing battle against their natural sleep patterns.
So even if we got rid of the time change, the way time zones are structured could still be impacting our health.
Exactly. It really highlights how interconnected we are with the natural world and how our modern systems don't always align with our biology.
Okay, this is all starting to make a lot more sense. But I have to ask, has anyone ever tried permanent daylight saving time before? I mean, if it's so bad, surely someone would have noticed by now.
Funny you should ask, because the U.S. actually gave it a shot back in the 1970s.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
What happened?
Well, to put it mildly, it was a bit of a disaster.
So what went wrong with the U.S. experiment?
Well, it was during the energy crisis.
Yeah.
And the thinking was that having more daylight in the evenings would lead to people using less electricity.
Makes sense?
Right. The problem is,
Yeah.
people really weren't a fan of those super dark mornings,
Oh, yeah.
especially in the winter.
Yeah.
It actually led to some safety concerns.
Really?
There were reports of increased accidents, especially involving school children
Oh, no.
who had to commute in the dark.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And to top it all off,
Yeah.
there wasn't even any clear evidence that it saved any energy in the end.
Wow, so it really backfired.
It did. Public opinion turned so strongly against it that Congress repealed the law after just 10 months.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah, it was a huge failure.
It sounds like a cautionary tale for anyone considering permanent DST.
Absolutely.
Oh.
It highlights the importance of considering all the potential consequences
Yeah.
before making a major change like this.
Right.
And really listening to public concerns.
Right, so bringing it back to BC, even ICBC, our provincial insurance corporation, has noticed some interesting trends related to the time change.
Yeah, absolutely. They've reported a spike in pedestrian-related crashes right after the springtime change
Oh, wow.
when we spring forward.
I guess that makes sense, with drivers being more tired and the evenings getting darker earlier.
Exactly. It's a
Yeah.
dangerous combination.
Yeah.
And ICBC is urging people to be extra cautious
Okay.
during those first few weeks after the time change to plan for extra travel time when it gets darker earlier.
That's great advice. It's easy to forget how much the time change can affect us,
It really does.
even in ways we don't realize.
It's like this ripple effect that extends beyond just our own personal experience.
And speaking of things we might not always think about,
Yeah.
you mentioned that pests can be affected by the time change too.
Yeah. Just like us, our furry friends have their own internal clocks.
Right.
And those clocks can get thrown off by the time change, too.
Oh, I can imagine how confused they must be when their dinner time suddenly changes.
To help them adjust,
Yeah.
experts recommend gradually shifting their feeding schedule
Okay.
by half an hour each day leading up to the time change.
That's a great tip. I'll have to remember that for my own dog.
Yeah, it's the little things.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, and I have to say, my head is spinning a little bit.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
If I'm understanding everything correctly, the science seems pretty clear that DST is messing with our sleep,
Yeah,
our bodies, and even our safety.
it seems that way.
So where do we go from here? What's the answer?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
There's no easy answer.
I figured as much. It seems like there are a lot of factors to consider.
Absolutely. We have to think about individual preferences,
Of course.
but also the broader societal implications.
Right.
We have to consider economics, energy consumption,
Yeah.
and even international coordination,
Right.
since we share time zones with other jurisdictions.
So it's a complicated issue with no easy solutions.
That's right. It's likely to continue for quite some time.
Okay. But I think it's important to have these conversations
I agree.
to really understand the science and the potential impacts of our choices.
The more informed we are, the better equipped we'll be to make those decisions that benefit both ourselves and society as a whole.
Okay, so to recap everything we've talked about today, it seems like there's a strong case to be made for sticking with standard time year-round,
Yeah.
especially from a health perspective.
The evidence is compelling.
And while the BC government is ready to make DST permanent,
Uh-huh.
They're waiting for the U.S. West Coast to take the lead.
Right, which, based on their past experience, might not be the best idea.
Yeah, we also explored how our internal clocks work
Right.
and how DST throws them out of whack,
Mhm.
potentially leading to a whole host of problems.
Exactly.
We even talked about how our location within a time zone
Mhm.
can affect how we experience DST and how people on that western edge might be at a disadvantage.
Right. It just goes to show how interconnected everything is and how important it is to consider all angles of an issue.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about our furry friends
Right.
who also need time to adjust to the time change.
They do.
Now, I'm curious, what are some of the other arguments people make for or against daylight saving time? We touched on the energy saving argument,
Right.
but are there other factors that come into play?
Oh, definitely. Some people argue that DST boosts the economy
Okay.
by giving people more daylight hours for shopping and recreation.
Sure.
Others say it reduces traffic accidents and crime rates
How so?
by providing more daylight during peak evening hours.
Okay.
But of course,
Yeah.
each of those arguments has its own counterpoints,
Right.
and the research is often mixed.
So there's a lot of different opinions on this topic.
There are. It's a complex issue with passionate advocates on all sides.
Yeah. It really does highlight how this seemingly simple question of like, what time is it,
Right.
is actually a gateway to a whole world of these fascinating debates.
It really is, and it kind of speaks to our ongoing quest to find that sweet spot where our modern lives align with the natural world.
I like that. So as we wrap up this deep dive into daylight saving time,
Yeah.
what's the one thing you really hope listeners take away from all of this?
I think the most important takeaway is that this issue goes beyond personal preference.
Right.
There's this complex interplay of science, societal needs, and even economic factors that we have to consider.
Yeah, it's so much more than just like choosing whether we want more daylight in the evenings or mornings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as you continue to explore this topic,
Mm-hmm.
I encourage you to think critically about the different perspectives and the potential consequences of each option.
I like that. Always be curious and always be questioning. Now, before we go, I have one final thought for you to ponder. What if, and hear me out on this one,
Yeah.
we actually embraced the darkness?
Embrace the darkness. What do you mean?
Well, we've talked a lot about how our bodies are naturally in tune with the rhythms of the sun and how standard time aligns more closely with those rhythms. So what if, instead of fighting against the shorter days of winter, we leaned into them?
That's an interesting perspective. It's like we're so conditioned to associate darkness with negativity.
Right.
But what if we reframed it as an opportunity for rest and rejuvenation?
Exactly. Imagine a world where instead of trying to artificially extend the day with DST, we embrace those cozy winter evenings. We could use that time for reading, connecting with loved ones, or simply just enjoying the peace and quiet of a longer night.
That's a compelling thought. It kind of ties into the growing movement of embracing things like mindfulness and slowing down, which are so important for our well-being.
It does, doesn't it? Maybe those long winter nights aren't so bad after all.
Yeah.
Maybe they're exactly what we need to recharge and reconnect with ourselves.
It's definitely food for thought.
Well, on that note, we're going to leave you to ponder that one. We hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on daylight saving time and maybe even inspired you to embrace the darkness a little bit more.
It's been great chatting with you.
Thanks for joining us, and until next time, happy exploring.